Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thanks again for sticking around for a lecture on King Lear. Um, so King Lear is well, I mean, it's one of my favorite plays. I don't feel as if I uh, have. I feel like I feel like I learn something new every time I read the play, talk about the play, teach the play, watch the play. Um, and so I'm hoping that I'll have that experience again with you all. Um, it's one of my favorite plays. I don't know if I can admit this, but I mean I'm going to. There's only one play I've ever seen a performance of Shakespeare's where I actually cried, and it was at the end of a really excellent King Lear. This play really gets to me for some reason, um, and so I'll try to talk maybe a little bit about like why I think this play gets to me. Today we're just going to do a kind of brief introduction to some of the key concepts in the tragedy as the play sets itself up in the start. Um, so but first, to talk a little bit about interpretive frames. So, um, so Shakespeare, as has we've seen this with so many of the other plays that we've talked about. Um, so Shakespeare has a source for this text, um, and but of course he does something new and different with it. He transforms it. Um, so there is a mythological, legendary, pre-Christian monarch of Britain called Lear, and so I mean he was not even in Shakespeare's day, he was not a very well known mythological legendary figure, but Shakespeare picks this figure and writes this play. And so on the one hand, there is a you know you know real history that gets written about Lear. Again, you can find it in Holinshed and some of the other um, historic, like chronicle texts about the history of Britain. Um, and that story is not tragic. It is a story about a king coming into conflict with his daughters, um, but it doesn't have the I don't want to, I'm not sure how far you all have read at this point, but I mean, this is a tragedy. There's going to be a lot of misery at the end of the play. Historically, the Lear that Shakespeare would have encountered was one that had a more happy ending to it, and so, in fact, there was a competing play by that other company, the Admiral's Men, about King Lear, Leir. That play gets printed right around the same time that Shakespeare's tragedy gets printed, and the Lear tells mostly the same story, but with, as I say, a more happy ending. And then um, and so that's basically kind of a romance, right? It has a sense of loss, but then a sense of recovery and restoration of things at the end of it, which is missing in Shakespeare's play. And then even Shakespeare's play, I mean, um, I'm not sure how you guys will feel that it affects you, but the 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 ending of the play was so dark for some audiences that in the restoration. So I mean, we've talked briefly about this kind of thing, but I'll mention it again. Right? There's a dramatic tradition in England that lasts until from it precedes Shakespeare. Right? So you have a native a dramatic tradition. You've got the people who are writing plays before Shakespeare gets to the theater, like Christopher Marlowe and some other figures. Then you have that period that we think of as Shakespeare's, right? So from the 1590 to about 1615 or so, and then the successors of Shakespeare, right? So from around 1615, he dies in 1616, up through 1642. And I alluded to this a second ago, an hour ago, when I was talking about Macbeth, that um, the English Civil War, one of the things that happens in it is that the theaters are closed in 1642. And then there's that political strife of the English Civil Wars, the interregnum, and then there's a restored monarchy, right? James the First's grandson is a guy who gets called Charles II, and he becomes king of England in 1660. That's what we call the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. Um, and and so in 1660, the theaters get reopened, and the theater itself has changed. It changes fairly significantly in that restoration period. So Charles II had been living in France. He'd experienced a very different kind of theatrical world. Among other things, um, the French allowed women to act in their plays, and so the Restoration Theater has women actors for the first time in the public theater and so on. But one of the things that happens is in the Restoration, several of Shakespeare's plays um, are like kind of revived, but they have to be adapted. They get changed in various kinds of ways in order to suit Restoration tastes. And so one of the things that happens to King Lear is that the very dark ending of Shakespeare's tragedy that we're going to look at, it has a happy ending grafted onto the end of it. So there's a really kind of dramatic, like sort of chopping and then kind of rewriting that happens at the end of the play. Um, so, I mean, that would be an interesting thing if you were interested in this play. You could take a look at that other play and talk about how it changes the ending of things if you wanted to. Anyway, so that's one interpretive frame, right? Thinking about what kind of a play this is. It's a tragedy. It's not a Decazibus tragedy in the way that Macbeth is, right? Where there's one guy, he's going through a whole bunch of stuff is happening to him, and he has this kind of rise and fall. That's not the kind of tragedy we have here in Lear. This is closer to a kind of more, I mean, I guess you could say it's maybe closer to what you think of as tragedy, right? A guy who has something terrible happens to him, and he kind of has to work his way through those terrible things. Um, Also, significantly, right, this play has a plot and a subplot, which Macbeth does not, right? So, I mean, it'll feel like a different kind of tragedy. Macbeth is such a short play relative to something like King Lear. Anyway, so just thinking about genre and the fact that this is a kind of tragedy, and that there are ways of telling the story of Lear that are less tragic and which were available to Shakespeare's audiences, and which some of Shakespeare's audiences seem to have demanded and essentially appreciated the transformation at the end of King Lear. So that restoration change in King Lear is the way that the play was performed, like all the way through the 18th and into the 19th century, because people preferred kind of sentimental, happy endings as opposed to this sort of tragic ending of things. Okay, so that's one frame of thinking about it, is from genre. Another one is just thinking about the kind of story that it tells. It has a sort of, and it has, there's a tradition, actually, a kind of an academic tradition of reading the play through a kind of folkloric, popular fairy tale genre kind of stuff. And that's another way that you could read this play, right? The opening part of the play definitely has um, a fairy tale sort of feel to it, right? So you've got King Lear, and he's going to say, I have three daughters. I love them equally, but I really kind of love one more. I'm going to have this contest and see who can persuade me to give them more of my kingdom, kind of thing, right? And so um, there's a way of, and we'll talk about these things in a second, but there's a way of looking at that contest as well, the flaw in the game that Lear seemed to be setting up there. But anyway, that seems like a kind of some kind of elf coming out of a woods and saying, here are three doors, choose one, kind of thing. I mean, it's that kind of quality to it. Another frame that you could use. So there's the genre one. There's the kind of alternative, kind of generic way of thinking about it. There's the politics of it, right? Again, maybe this could be like the tail wagging the dog instead of the other way around, or putting the cart before the horse, I suppose. But I mean, it is certainly possible to read this play as commenting on, and in fact, when I was in graduate school, I wrote a couple papers around this idea, on commenting on the contemporary politics of Shakespeare at that point. Right? Again, this is a Jacobean tragedy, Um, and one of the big um, pushes that King James was doing at the start of his time on the English throne was trying to, so politically, um, James he was the King of Scotland because he was the heir of Mary, the Mary Queen of Scots, all right, um, who'd been the legitimate monarch of Scotland in the middle part of the 16th century. So he succeeded his mother there and becomes the king, and he gets crowned at Scone and all that kind of stuff. And then his older cousin once removed, right, who is Queen Elizabeth, when she dies and she has no heirs, the crown also comes to him, right? So the crown of England. So he is the king of Scotland by virtue of being Mary Queen of Scots' son. He's king of England and Ireland by virtue of being the heir of Queen Elizabeth. And so uh, so he had three kings and two scepters, right? That's a thing that Macbeth talks about in the that vision of Banquo's heirs. He's got three crowns, right? Scotland, England, and Ireland, and two scepters, one for Scotland and one for Britain. Um, but the thing is that, and in fact, this historically, this is actually what ends up happening. If you ever care about this kind of thing, if you've ever wondered how Germans came to be the monarchs of England, the Hanoverians, it's because they never got the kind of the thing that James is trying to do when he comes to the throne never got finalized. And so when James's great granddaughter, his last great granddaughter, dies, and there's a branch of his family that's been declared illegitimate. Um, when she dies, the throne the throne goes back up and then over into a German prince's family, and that's why the Hanovers in the 18th century are George the First, George the Second, George the Third are the kings of England. So what James is trying to do is at the very start of his reign, he's trying to get Parliament, his English Parliament, to pass some laws that will consolidate all of those crowns and scepters and so on into um, one new monarchy. And he persistently calls his kingdom Great Britain, right? That is larger Britain because it's got England and Scotland in it. But he is technically the King of England and the King of Scotland, and he can't get Parliament to pass the laws that would allow for the union of the crowns, is what it's called. Um, and so you could see the play, right, which is about dividing the island of Britain into three parts, one of which is up in the north, like Scotland, and one of which is down in the south, as being a kind of commentary on that unifying attempt that James is doing versus the dissolving attempt, which is what King Lear does, right? King Lear has a unified kingdom, which is what King James would want, and he splits his kingdom, which is what James would not want, right? So there's a way of kind of looking at the tragedy as having a commentary on these issues of of the union of the crowns. Finally, it's also important that Shakespeare writes a very significant subplot into this tragedy, the plot involving Gloucester, Edmund, and Edgar. And also, he does a really excellent job of making sure that the two plots, they're not just two plots, right? They actually do intersect around the figure of Edmund. Um, but but the two plots they mirror each other, right? You've got an old man, Lear, an old man, Gloucester. And they've got heirs, right? Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia in the case of Lear, and Edmund and Edgar in the case of Gloucester. And there's a kind of problematic generational issue between the heirs and the heads of the household kind of thing. And so you can see these two plots as kind of like shedding light on each other, right? Sort of working like a foil to help kind of make you see that the one or the other plot more clearly as a result of the first plot, right? And so paying attention to that is, I think, also significant, right? Anyway, so that's another part of like making sure you have like the frame for interpreting this the play. Okay, and then a second issue. So that's the first set of issues, just thinking about frames. Second issue is around the textual background of this play, and this has been a really hot topic and really kind of complicated, at least among academics. Like, I'm sure that outside of academia, nobody cares about this, but among academics, it is actually a fairly sort of prickly kind of issue around what to do about the texts of King Lear. So I've talked about the textual history of Shakespeare's plays before. In the case of King Lear, there are two texts, two printings of the play that have a certain amount of authority. There's the first time that the play is printed, that is, leaves the manuscript, goes to a print shop, goes through the printing process, and is printed, is in 1608. There's a quarto, right, one of those kind of small versions of the text like essentially a paperback version, right? That's the 1608 quarto of the text. And then there's a text that is printed in the larger complete works, the folio of Shakespeare, in 1623. Now, that technically that's posthumous, right? But we think of that as reflecting like theatrical properties, right? Handwritten scripts that had been, in the possession of the theater, and that they then printed to honor Shakespeare on his death. Okay, now in some cases, and we've talked about the idea that there are some plays that are in the folio, that complete works of 1623, that were never printed in Shakespeare's lifetime. So if we didn't have the folio, we would never know anything about, say, like Twelfth Night or I don't know, Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus. There's a whole bunch of plays that weren't printed in Shakespeare's lifetime, like while Shakespeare was alive, that show up in the folio. If we didn't have the folio, we wouldn't have those plays. But there are some plays that had existed in various states of goodness, during Shakespeare's lifetime. There are what we used to call the bad quartos, right? So there's Romeo and Juliet, and Hamlet, and Henry V. Okay, well, there's a play like Richard II. We looked at Richard II, right, which is a play that has gone through some censorship. But the text of Richard II, the first printing of 1597, and the 1623 folio, other than the scenes that have been chopped out or restored, those two texts are not very different at all. A text like Romeo and Juliet was printed. They used to call it a pirated edition. Was printed without Shakespeare's name on the title page, and is not a very good. There's clearly some kind of corruption in the text. And so a year after that text comes out, Shakespeare, there's another edition of that play, and it says, newly revised by William Shakespeare, right? And it has a kind of authority to it. So that's quarto 1, quarto 2, the bad quarto, the good quarto, the pirated quarto, the legitimate quarto, however you want to think about that. And then you have those two texts, and then you have the folio version of Romeo and Juliet. King Lear represents a completely different and really complicated case, because it's not that the 1608 version is bad. The 1608 version is really, really good. And it's not that the 1623 version is bad. The 1623 version is also really good. And it's not that they're somehow one's legitimate and one's not legitimate. They both seem to have come out of Shakespeare's hand, and they're like 80% the same. But it's not like the case of, to give you an example, Henry V is a play that is essentially half the length. The quarto version and the folio version, the quarto version is about half the length. And what you can see is that almost all of the quarto version is in the folio version. And so what seems to have happened is there was a long handwritten text which got dramatically reduced for performance, and then when it was printed in the folio, that long text was restored. That's not what happens in King Lear. There are actually significant differences even within the play. And so, and you can actually see this kind of visually. I've got a good example here. If you were one of the people who ended up buying the this red complete works, one of the things that the edition that most of us are using is this less expensive individual paperback version of just King Lear. But one of the things that Oracle does in the paperback version is that he presents the quarto text and the folio text sequentially, right? So you have all of the quarto text, and then on page 137, you get to the end of the quarto text, and then 138, you get to the end of the quarto text, and then the folio text starts on the next page. In this larger format book, what Oracle does is to print the texts side by side. So the column on the left, all the way through the text, the column on the left is the 1608 quarto version, and the column on the right is the 1623 folio version. And on the next page, it's the same, right? Lots of these other large anthologies, they do the same thing, right? So if we had used the Norton Shakespeare, for instance, it has that side-by-side version of King Lear. Okay, well, one thing that you can see if you put the text side by side is that you can see that there are just chunks that are different in the two texts. And so here, this will visually show you an example of this. This is in Act 4, Scene 2. You've got the quarto text over here, and then what they do with the folio text is where there's stuff that's just not in the folio that is in the quarto, it's just presented as blank space. Now you might think, is that all that significant? Well, if you turn the page in this edition, right, so you've got quarto, folio, you've got a little bit of stuff missing here, but then you get over to this page, you've got the quarto, and you have an entire page of there's just nothing there because the folio is shorter at this point. Okay, now there have been various like serious arguments among Shakespeareans about this, what to do about all this, right? Because what ended up happening is that the folio comes out in 1623, and then there are three more folios in the 1600s. There's a 1630 folio, there's a 1660 something folio, there's a 1680 something folio, and so those four folios, they all just print the same text. So they always work from the folio text. But in the early 18th century, so like 1712, I think it is, there's a guy called Tybbalds. And he, I mean, at this point, Shakespeare has like caught on as like the figurehead for English literature. Even in like only 100 years after he's dead, he's like the guy, right? And so Tybbalds produces like a 30 volume, individual, like you can buy each volume individually and get like the complete works of Shakespeare, to put on your bookshelf and that kind of thing. And one of the things that Tybbalds does is he goes back and he finds as many early texts as he can, and he compares them to see if there's anything different from the most recent folio edition of Shakespeare's works at the end of the 1600s. And when he gets to Lear, he sees that there is a big, there's a significant amount. And it's not just that the folio is shorter, it's that the folio is different in places. So you've got stuff that's in the quarto, which is not in the folio, but then you also have stuff that's in the folio, but it's not in the quarto, right? So it's not a simple thing like, here's this long text that Shakespeare cut down into a shorter version of the folio. It's that here's this version of Shakespeare which has stuff added and stuff subtracted when you compare the two versions together. So what Tybbalds does is he just puts all of that together. He says anything that Shakespeare wrote, we want that. So he makes this what we call the conflated text. And so from basically around 1712 until, let's say, the 1970s, if you were going to read King Lear, you were going to read a version that was a conflated text. It took the two different versions and it combined as much of it as possible so that you got one, what was thought of as a complete version of King Lear. Now, nobody seems to have really kind of had a problem with that. There are like kind of squeaks about it in the early part of the 20th century. But when the Oxford University Press people started working on their edition of Shakespeare in the 1970s, 1980s, they decided that they were going to unedit the text and give a quarto version and a folio version. And this was a really controversial decision. And in fact, they had to write a whole book justifying their decision on King Lear. There's a book called The Division of the Kingdoms And that's partly, again, for me, right, interested in the politics. If you look back at the Cordo and the Folio version of King Lear, in that first scene when Lear says he's going to look at the map and divide up the territory, in the Cordo he calls it the kingdom, and in the Folio he calls it the kingdoms. And that's just an S, and that seems like that could be really a simplistic kind of thing. But I mean, that suggests either that these are three separate kingdoms that have been joined under one, or one large kingdom that's going to get divided into three, right? Anyway, so they have to justify this decision. And it has not sat well with some people that they made that decision. And so, about, well, I mean, there's been a ton of debate about this ever since then. But about 2 years ago, a really significant and powerful Shakespearean scholar called Stanley Wells writes a book called The One True Lear. And he argues, right, that Shakespeare had one in his mind. Shakespeare had one big Lear, and that the Cordo represents part of it, and that the Folio represents a different part of it, and that the conflated text is necessary because that's the closest thing to the whole thing that Shakespeare had in mind for King Lear. And then because he's a big and important guy, he got this book published, and people savaged this book. There's a guy who just, if you're interested in this thing, in this particular issue, there's a guy called Holger Scott Shine, Chyme, at the University of Toronto, and he wrote about a 500 tweet thread, like he hate read this book, and on every page, like pointed out every mistake that the guy was making. And I mean, it's just a kind of brutal takedown of that book. Okay, why does it matter? It matters in the sense that, like, I mean, it matters in the sense of like what we think of as literary, what we think of as important, what we think of in terms of revision, right? Shakespeare seems to have been happy with the 1608 version, and he would also have been happy with the 1623 version. So how can he be happy with two versions that are actually kind of different? What are we supposed to do with that? And so one argument would be, well, you should combine them. And one argument would be, this is the early Shakespeare and the late Shakespeare, or, Shakespeare of his first thoughts and Shakespeare of his second thoughts. And so maybe we shouldn't unedit those texts. Anyway, it's a complex thing. You don't necessarily have to get into it, but it's worth knowing that there is a really vexed and complicated textual history around King Lear, as one of the things that you take away from our class together. Okay, I'm going to pause there and actually kind of jump into the play. So let me just take 2 seconds.